All right. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining in on the final Marine Institute Graduate Society seminar of the semester. Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, for rearranging your schedule to make this work. This wasn't supposed to work. I didn't tell anybody yet, but I was getting there. We will be back next semester in the same place. Usually it's Hampton Hall at the Marine Institute and on WebEx. But we are going to change the time from noon to 1 p.m. Newfoundland time instead of the 11 to 12. And that's kind of to help the West Coasters when we have a West Coast presenter. And also a lot of people have, their lunch break and they can come and they don't have classes and stuff like that. So, all right. So now we'd like to provide a land acknowledgement for Newfoundland and Labrador. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Mike Allen from the University of Florida. Dr. Allen is a professor at UF. He graduated with his PhD in fisheries and statistics from Mississippi State University in 1996. His research is primarily focused on evaluating fish population and fish community responses to changes in fishing mortality, habitat, and species interactions. He generally studies recreational fisheries, but he also teaches fish population dynamics and field ecology of aquatic organisms. I will say I took Dr. Allen's Pop Dye course, and he and his co-teacher, postdoc at the time, Dr. Stephanie Shaw, were fantastic. I still have access to those online lectures as I was talking with him earlier. And I revisited them twice since the course ended. Once when I was doing during advanced fishery stock assessment course that I had at UF, and once here at the Marine Institute when I was in Arnaud's Pop Dye section. So as I was telling Dr. Allen, they were very far ahead of their time when it came to the online teaching stuff and COVID. So they were, I wanted to share that some of your lectures to our professors so that they could get caught up. But now we're back in person, so
okay.
So I don't do that anymore. Yeah. So with all that, here's Dr. Allen.
Well, thank you, Colin, and thanks for those of you able to tune in and anyone that watches the recording of this. I'm happy to be here, and greetings from. I'm in a little town called Cedar Key, Florida, which is on the Gulf of Mexico in Central Florida. What I wanted to talk about today was a project that we have, an ongoing collaboration looking at a snook expansion in our area. And the reason I wanted to mention this is it's just such a striking account of how climate change is influencing food webs with fisheries implications, which I'm certain that you are seeing changes in your systems in Newfoundland associated with climate change. But this example is a really nice one. And so I'm not going to give a super long talk, and we'll have some time for discussion after, but I'll just go ahead and get started. Like any project, this is a big collaboration, and we're doing it in concert with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. We do a lot of work with the state agency. Also in Florida, we have water management districts, which are a state institution that deals with managing freshwater resources in the state. And the water management districts are also heavily engaged with us here. So there's a lot of folks involved in this, and I'm just giving the talk to summarize it. A lot of different partners, these are mainly within the state sources with regard to water management districts and the State Game and Fish Agency, which is the Florida FWC. So as I'm sure you're aware, our climate is changing rapidly. 20 of the warmest years on records have occurred in the last 22 years. CO2 is increasing. It's pretty bad news all the way around. Arctic ice is melting and changing ocean currents, which can even magnify and intensify those changes through time, which is what we're seeing now, which is even more troubling. Natural disasters in my part of the world, hurricanes are a major concern, and our frequency and intensity of hurricanes have increased substantially in the last decade. Hurricane season is one that we always look to with nervousness as June turns to July in Central Florida. Uh, So I'm going to mention the area that I'm in. I'm in Cedar Key here, which is located on the map, and it's in the Big Bend of Florida. So it's in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, and it's in a fairly pristine area that doesn't have a lot of development, extensive short seagrass and oyster reefs. Um, it's an area where jobs are disproportionately reliant on natural resources. These include things like agriculture, forestry, and shellfish aquaculture, as well as tourism and hunting and fishing kind of activity. So it's an outdoor kind of place. Um, it's characterized by the Swanee River, which is one of the largest undammed rivers in the eastern United States. There's not a single water control structure on the river. A small low head thing up in Georgia, but basically it's an unconfined river, which is unique. But we're seeing big changes, and sea level rise is something that we live with daily here in Cedar Key, and this is the mean monthly sea level plotted on year, and you can see an increasing trend in the sea levels through time. The slope on that is about 2 millimeters per year on average. But the troubling thing is that the rate of sea level rise is increasing, and we see that really strongly here. So that over the last 20 years, the actual sea level rise has been somewhere around 8 millimeters a year, not 2 millimeters a year. So climate is warming and sea levels are rising, and the rate of both of those things is increasing through time. Now, obviously, that has a tone of doom and gloom, and there's plenty of doom and gloom to think about what the implications of this are on food webs and social ecological systems, including fisheries. But one of the points of this talk is that not all effects of climate change are going to be detrimental to humans. There are some aspects that people may think are positive, and there's lots of aspects that people may see as negative. Um, this just shows rising temperatures here in Cedar Key. This is again, these kind of changes in temperature and sea level rise are locally evident in our recent time series. It's caused a big change in vegetation communities in our part of the world. Black mangroves have increased substantially in our area. Previously, this was just an area that was focused on salt marsh, spartina grasses, and oyster reefs. And we see mangroves just coming in like crazy in the last 25 years. This is an image of an island in December 1998, and you can see the same island in 2016. Just extensive black mangroves in what was previously salt marsh. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Mangroves are good aquatic habitat and they're good for fish and wildlife, but it is a change from a salt marsh habitat to a mangrove habitat. And we see these effects locally really strongly here in our part of the world. So the snook is a member of the Centropomidae family, and it's a very popular sport fish. It's an iconic sport fish here in Florida. They're harvestable only by recreational anglers. They're fairly well managed. Snook are not considered overfished. They're well managed in the state with bag limits and size limits and closed seasons. They're a hermaphroditic fish. They switch from male to female as they grow. Most of them switch to female. Some of them will stay males their whole life. Um, but they're a subtropical species, and pardon my use of Fahrenheit in here. Some of this seminars for public consumption in our region, and I know that you're used to Celsius, but what negative snook have mortality below about 50 degrees C, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and about 10 degrees C. Um, So anything that drops below that is going to cause mortality of snook. And we've seen that even as recently as 2010, there was a massive snook cold kill in Florida that went all the way down into the Everglades. And we'll expect to see those kinds of events again. But historically, this fish was not found in our region. It was found south of here, now near Tampa, and not in our region at all. In partnership with the Florida FWC, they have a monitoring program in place that's allowed us to really document what's happened. And what it's turned out is that snook first started showing up in around 2006, um, and you can see that as we get work down to the lower right panel, the number of black dots just increases. So these are snook collections in a standard sampling monitoring program. And snook have just proliferated to become common throughout the whole area since 2016, and this just continues to increase. So now we have snook that are not only established, they're reproducing. We have snook of all sizes, and there's a fishery that has developed here locally for this game fish that historically was not found in Cedar Key at all. It's interesting when the fish first came in here in the early time span, it was just large individuals probably that migrated up from the south, but they became established and started reproducing. And by the recent years, in the last 5 years, now we see all sizes of snook. We see viable reproduction every year. So they're fully established. And we published a paper in the Plus One journal in 2020 that documented this expansion of snook in the area. And these are excerpts from that paper that was led by Caleb Pertlebaugh with FWC. On the left-hand side, you can see the exponential increase in snook catches in Cedar Key. And this is, again, from a standardized monitoring program. Super strong effect here of an expanding population. We're still seeing this effect since 2018. Snook populations are still increasing, but we are seeing evidence that the rate of increase is declining. Snook may be reaching a carrying capacity here in our region, and they're now, fully established and abundant. In that paper, we published an expansion of the snook range from Tarpon Springs, just north of Tampa, up to north of the Swanee River. And now we consider this to be the new established range of snook in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. They're fully established here. Now, some interesting debates go on because when I mentioned mangroves have been present in Cedar Key before. There were mangroves here in the 50s, and then cold kills in the 80s knocked the mangroves back down south. We didn't see mangroves here for about 15 years. And then since the mid-90s, mangroves have been expanding again. So the question is, is this a climate change effect, or is this, just a periodic condition of a warmer period and a colder, that will be followed by another cold period? And I really think that this snook invasion that we've seen has not happened before. And the reason is that these fish are now fully established, and they're using the springs in the winter, which I'll show you. So they found thermal refuge here, which is going to allow them to persist through cold events, I believe. And I think that even though we may get cold kills of snook here in the future, and I expect that we will, I don't think they'll be extirpated from the system because of thermal refuge habitat associated with groundwater springs. I'll show you some of that. This is just a few graphs of water temperatures, and you can see this is the cold event that happened in 2009, 2010. Water temperatures this is down in Southwest Florida, south of us, about 4 or 5 hour drive. And this caused a major snook kill throughout Florida in 2010, all the way down to the Florida Keys. There were dead snook. And there was one estimate the FWC had that it was a 40% mortality of snook statewide from that event in 2010. Interestingly, the population rebounded extremely quickly, and by 2018, it was fully recovered from this cold kill event and had expanded northward. One of the things we started doing in about 5 years ago to quantify not only the expansion of snook, but their habitat use is putting acoustic tags in snook to do telemetry. These are VIMCO tags. And we've been putting tags in about 20 to 40 fish per year every year for the last 5 years. And you can see the dots on the map here are acoustic receivers, VR2 acoustic receivers. And so we started tracking these fish. Now, when the snook first came into Florida, into this part of Florida, I really felt like what was going to happen is the fish were going to be here in the summer and then move south in the winter, because that's what a lot of our more tropical species do. Things like cobia, bull shark, animals that are here in the summertime, but they migrate back south in the winter. And that's what I expected the snook to do. We started tagging these animals and following their movements around. And as it turned out, all of a sudden we got a phone call from some of our USGS colleagues in the Swanee River that had an acoustic array set up for Gulf of Mexico sturgeon. And they were listening for sturgeon, but they said, hey, we're starting to get a lot of detections of fish. And we started looking, and it turns out that our snook are migrating into the Swanee River every winter. And they're using the Swanee River and associated springs as a thermal refuge during the wintertime period. And this has been a consistent pattern now we've seen for the past 5 years. So these fish have become established, and they've also found winter refuge habitat that can protect them against cold kill scenarios here. And that's why I think this has never happened before, because I believe if they had ever gotten established here the way they are now, they would not be extirpated because there's enough groundwater thermal refuge habitat. I'm not asking you to interpret this other than to look at the red and the blue and the green. But basically what it is the blue is the fish are in Cedar Key out in the estuary, and the green is at the Swanee River. And you can see the dates on the x-axis. The point of this is what's happening is our fish are going into the Swanee River in the winter months. In the summer months, they come back out into the Cedar Key estuary. And we see this year after year after year. And so the river itself is warmer during the winter, but it also has a lot of first magnitude springs. These are large springs that dump tens of millions of gallons of water that is about 20 degrees C into the river all the time. And so that creates a lot of thermal refuge habitat. And that's what they're using in the winter period, is in the Swanee River. And that's where our fish go. And they go there generally around Halloween, around the end of October, and they stay there until the first part of April. And then they'll come back out in the estuary after it warms up. We know that some of the fish occupy the river year round, and there's been snook all the way up into Georgia in the Swanee River, so way up north. But like most places in Florida, most of the snook are on the coast and in the river only temporarily. But this thermal refuge habitat constriction is really an interesting thing, because the state is charged with managing minimum flows and levels and minimum freshwater flow regulations to try to protect ecological services of the system. And the amount of freshwater flow is going to obviously influence the amount of spring discharge is going to influence the amount of thermal refuge that snook have during the winter. So the conservation agencies are working with us to try to identify critical thermal refuge habitat for snook and how that changes with changes in groundwater flow. So this puts a real management knob on the question about snook habitat use, and then potentially to use snook as a tool for setting minimum flow and level regulations. So that's what we've been doing. We've been tagging fish and tracking their movements in the Swanee River system, both down in the coast in the orange and up in kind of the spring system. And we have snook throughout this area. We've tagged fish. We're tagging fish right now, and we'll be tagging more right after the first of the year. The seasonal abundance, this is just the Cedar Key abundance, and you can see the bars show that the fish are in Cedar Key during the summer months. In the winter months, our catches in Cedar Key go down, and this is when the catches go up in the Swanee River. Again, showing kind of the seasonal patterns, where the red dots on the left are where the fish are in the summertime, summer and early fall. And then in the wintertime, we see the fish move up towards the mouth of the creeks and mouth of the Swanee River, where there is warmer water. And so these seasonal migrations are happening every year now. We have had some cold events that are very close to the tolerance for snook. Last winter, we had only one event, but it was in the middle of January where the water temperatures got to the level that we could expect some mortality of snook. Um, and we tracked the fish through that. They actually left part of East Pass and went out into the estuary during one cold event just for a short time and came back in. Um, but then we had fish that were using the springs that never left and stayed in the thermal refuge there. So so we're doing that. And so the hypothesis that we're working on is that the springs that come into the Swanee River create a plume of warm water. And the amount of thermal refuge habitat that's going to exist for these animals is going to depend on the spring flow rate and also the river water temperature and the river discharge. When the river is low and spring discharge is high, there's a larger thermal refuge habitat from the springs. The worst case scenario for snook would be very high Swanee River discharge that's cold, so a lot of rain and a lot of cold fronts that cause the river to be cold, and reduced groundwater flow from springs in the system, which would be the most critical stress of thermal refuge habitat in that situation, because the thermal refuge would be squeezed into a smaller and smaller area. So we're exploring this now with a lot of temperature loggers and active telemetry of these fish. So this is something that the management agencies have really gotten behind, about the potential to use snook as a management criteria for setting minimum flows and levels in coastal spring systems, which is really good. And this is what we're working on now. So there's some other before I go to questions, there's some other aspects of this that we're working on. One is like, what is the food web linkages that may happen with snook? You know, snook have high diet overlap with predators that are native in the region, like red drum and spotted sea trout. And they actually also, snook consume spotted sea trout and to some degree red drum as well. So I expect there to be impacts of snook, and we've done some food web modeling in EcoPath with EcoSim that show there's likely to be effects of this snook invasion into our area. Anglers love this. This is, you know, anglers love the opportunity to catch snook, but the implications of that could mean that there's also negative impacts to some historically important fisheries like red drum and spotted sea trout. So we're continuing to monitor this and also build some food web models to explore it. But I wanted to mention this, give this seminar today just as an example that you could see of how climate change is influencing and shifting distributions of fish and what the implications are for fisheries and people. So this has been a topic that we're actively researching and we'll probably be working on for the next 5 or so years at least. So it's been a fun project to work, and then not often that you get to see such a clear-cut example of how climate change is changing the distribution and habitat overlap for animals. So I'll open it up for any questions, and I appreciate your attention today.
All right. Does anybody have any questions? So I have a question about other local animals on the river and how you think they might be affected. So I'm thinking lower on the trophic level than drum, and I'm also thinking higher than drum. So any other predators and how they would be impacted from the snook being there. And is there anything that targets snook aside from people that would be benefiting from the snook being there?
Well, you know, in the times I've given this seminar call and I haven't gotten that question, it's a really good one. And in fact, there is some really nice evidence that we've seen lately, including some photographs showing that bottlenose dolphins are actually consuming snook. And we have videos of actually snook being eaten by these bottlenose dolphins. Now, these snook occupy different habitats than traditional red drum and spotted sea trout. They occupy, in the summertime, they're in channels in large aggregations. and they're in a little bit deeper water, and they're in these spawning aggregations. And I believe that they are a new food source for dolphins that dolphins can be taken advantage of. Um, as juveniles, they get eaten by all kinds of things. But adult snook don't have a lot of predators besides large sharks, which we have a lot of sharks, and bottlenose dolphins. But the effects of the food web are going to be interesting. I mean, but there's also so much changing at once. We've got seagrass composition changing, temperatures changing, other species are changing, but one of the most predominant changes we see is this increase in snook abundance. So following the effect on the food web is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a lot more complicated that, especially in Florida where you have so many different species.
Yeah, we've got lots of species. So Jen.
Oh, hi. Hi. It's a very interesting talk. I didn't expect that the species will move that fast north.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I do have a question. You mentioned that the Snook kind of reached carrying capacity within a not very long time. Do you like what's limiting them? And do you expect that carrying capacity to change as they displace more, say, other species or trout
Yeah.
or drum?
Well, it's a great question. I don't know what's limiting them. What we can say is two things. One is that the rate of snook expansion here is declining. So we are now we see more and more snook every year still, but not to the degree, not the rate of increase that we saw previously. I believe there's some density dependence probably going on now. Up to now, the condition of these fish, the snook, have been the fattest snook that are found in the whole state of Florida. These have been very robust, very beefy, large animals have obviously lots and lots of forage. But what I expect to see is as this continues to increase, is we're going to see condition go down and more of a density dependent response to their abundance. I think we're just now starting to see that. And so I think over the next 2 to 3 years, that's going to be the interesting thing. And then they'll be limited, I think, mostly by interest-specific competition. They're going to be limited by, there's so many snook mouths to feed that there's issues with foraging and that kind of thing. But it's a fascinating question, and the degree to which these other species influence their abundance, we just don't know. We're doing some diet work and some trophic modeling to look at that, but it's going to be an interesting area to pursue. So,
Wow. Are there any other species that eat them
um,
or just top?
as juveniles, lots of stuff eats snook. I mean, and they're found back in the salt marsh as juveniles. So when they're 1 to 10 centimeters long, they get eaten by everything from freshwater to marine predators, birds, wading birds, etc. As adults, the number of predators on them is really low. Besides the dolphin and the sharks that I mentioned before.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep. Awesome.
All right, Keith, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk. Really interesting. I guess I had two questions. So you mentioned that the anglers are thrilled is too strong a word, but enjoy going after this fish. That's understandable. But you mentioned a couple other fish. I think it was a red drum and trout. And what is the reaction, I guess, in the larger community to the arrival of this fish? It's having impacts on traditional stocks and maybe other aspects of the ecosystem.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think most people are very happy that snook most anglers are happy that snook are here and it's a new species that they have an opportunity to catch. But I have heard rumblings of folks being dissatisfied with their catches of spotted sea trout. And historically, in the wintertime, both spotted sea trout, red drum, and snook go into the creeks where it's warmer. Historically, that's been a great time to catch spotted sea trout, and sea trout don't have a closed season, so they're available to harvest all the time.
Okay.
Now, I've had some anglers complain that all they're catching in the rivers is snook, and they can't keep the snook because the season's closed in the winter. So, so I think there is some pending dissatisfaction with people about the potential for the snook to have displaced or replaced spotted sea trout, for example.
Right.
And those kind of
And
conflicts could only increase through time. I mean, we've seen this further south. When the coal kill happened further south in Florida, red drum populations expanded substantially. So there's competition between these predators, and an increase in one predator is going to come at a cost of another.
yeah, right. Okay, so these other fish, they're the anglers go after them too. They're not necessarily a
Yeah,
commercial species.
right. Yeah, these are all
Okay.
three are recreational fisheries. Yeah.
They're recreational. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess the other question then is, so it's kind of a follow-up to Jim's, the it's a large fish, like you said, not a lot preys on the adults, but there's a lot does on the juveniles. What sort of, and I guess since they've been expanding some of these ecological barriers aside from temperature aren't there. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, why is it that these other predators haven't kept the juveniles? There hasn't been high mortality on juveniles, and therefore there wouldn't be as many adults.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, what has allowed this invasion to
Aside from
happen?
temperature, yeah.
Yeah. I think my sense is, and we haven't really have work on that shows this per se, but the habitat use of the snook is really different than our native predators, both as adults and as juveniles.
Okay.
The snooks tend to be way back in marshes, so I think they actually had a window of spatial and temporal relaxation where they could get established.
Okay.
Adults definitely use habitats that we don't typically see spotted sea trout and red drum use. And the juveniles also
Okay.
use closer inshore, shallower, more fresh water than typical spotted sea trout and red drum. These snooks can tolerate 100% fresh water. The eggs can't develop the eggs need an estuary, but once the fish hatch, they can tolerate 100% fresh water. So they do have an advantage there to use habitats that may not be available to the other species. It's a great question.
Okay, so refuge is important. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any more questions?
I know everybody's busy before the holiday, and I appreciate you making the time to join for the seminar, Colin, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah,